my name is Caleb Pierce, and I am the president at Get Smarter Prep. And I have been here since early 2012. And before that, my former life, I worked in higher education. I worked at some small liberal arts schools for about 10 or 11 years, kind of helping them with their enrollment, admissions, financial aid, things like that. So it's actually more fun to be on this side of the desk, helping students actually prepare and improve their scores and get ready for college than even evaluating those transcripts. Sometimes I miss being on that college campus because there's always just so much energy, but I wouldn't trade what I do for anything. So anyway, a little bit about me. Today we're going to go through some of the current trends, and I think we have 10 of them. Some of these trends I could spend literally 10 or 15 minutes on each one. But I'm going to try to limit myself so that I don't drag this out forever. So I'm going to try to cut myself off at times. If you have some clarifying questions or something that's been on your mind and you just want to know, feel free to type that into the chat box. And Jill Purcell, our marketing director, is available to help me kind of manage that and make sure that I'm not missing those along the way. Okay. All right, let's kind of get rolling here. I'm going to start off with a few of the basics. As we're going through, we're seeing, let's see here. So again, you know a little bit about me now. Get Smarter Prep is Kansas City based, and we have some of the most focused, targeted prep for students in the metro. And that includes content, that includes ACT, that includes GRE and LSAT and all sorts of different other tests and preparation areas. And we value the individual, and everybody's going to be a little bit different. So we want to do what's right for each student and make sure that we're approaching the exam or the curriculum or whatever it may be in a way that makes the most sense for them, because these tests are very different than what students see in school. So we try to take that into account and take into account students' needs as well. All right. We also, again, I'll tell you, one of the toughest parts of my entire job is finding tutors that can excel here at Get Smarter Prep. We frequently have amazing testers who come through. They score very, very well as they enter training, but unfortunately, very few make it through. Maybe about 25% of our tutors make it through training because maybe they're good at testing, but they're not good at communicating and actually teaching to students. And that's the important piece, right? And it's not just the knowledge in the head, but we want to make sure that they can convey that effectively to our students. So everybody's scoring the top 1% in each section after training. And then we kind of, again, make sure that we're continuing our education. And sometimes ACT or LSAT or GRE or whatever test we're looking at sometimes sneaks in a new question or type or two. And we just, as a team, kind of refocus and build some additional tools and continue to relearn the important things. The other fun thing that happened this year is ACT had moved away from certain types of questions for five or 6 years, and then they reintroduced them. So a lot of us were very familiar with the type. We just hadn't seen it for so long, so we hadn't put quite as much of an emphasis on it. So we're following those trends. We're making sure we're targeting exactly what students need along the way. All right. So let's get into the actual presentation. Like I said, there are 10 topics here. Some of them are going to be a little bit more in depth, and some of them I'm going to breeze through fairly quickly so that I can spend more time on those that I deem more important. All right. But again, if you have questions, feel free to chat at us. So the first one, if any of you attended the first webinar in this series, this is one of the things that I talked about is demonstrated interest, and more so I kind of just define it as a term. This is something that I think is going to be very, very important, maybe even up to 1/3 of the admission decision for the class of 2021. So we'll get to it in a second, but some of the most important things, I would argue that the three most important things to college admissions offices are: one, they want to see the GPA, right? They want to get that, maybe even a class rank, and compare it to their peers and see what that looks like. Second is strength of schedule. And third is the test scores. Well, this is such a strange time for class of 2021. Very arguably, the most important semester is sixth semester. So this past spring, which we all know was kind of a mess, right? And it was a mess not only for our students here in the metro, but for students across the entire country. Did you know that most schools actually didn't even do like a grade like we did for most students did in our area? They just did a pass fail, which literally, how do you translate that into a GPA? You can't, right? So sixth semester grades are kind of pointless. And now even seventh semester, which are the second most important, especially for those who are maybe not scoring quite as well or just focused on regular admission in the spring. Those are things that, again, we don't, for a lot of us, we still don't even know what school's going to look like. And maybe it's already started or it starts next week. So I think that there's going to be some challenges in actually measuring those pieces. And on top of that, class of 2021, they've gone test optional. A lot of schools anyway have. So I think there are just metrics that we've relied upon in higher education for so long, and those main pieces have disappeared. So what are they going to make the decision upon? And I think this demonstrated interest is an easy, simple, very direct way to improve our chances of getting accepted to a school. And this is where a student has to do some heavy lifting. This is not mom or dad sending an email to an admissions officer. This is the student engaging, asking questions, a follow-up question. Don't think that you're bugging them until they tell you that you're bugging them. Okay. It's okay to send a few emails. The other big one that I would very readily recommend is getting on the website, right? Get on there, go check out some different virtual presentations that the school is giving. They're going to track that information. The campus tour, there's so many virtual tours. There are very few schools. I think University of Oklahoma is the only school that I know of in this region that is actually doing in-person tours. So we want to make sure that we're showing that interest. And this is great because we don't have to plan a trip. We don't have to travel several hours and spend an entire weekend visiting a college anymore. Now we can hop on their website and demonstrate that interest in an easier way from our bedroom or from the dining room table, and the whole family can kind of follow along. I think that could be a very good, useful tool going forward. Okay. So this demonstrated interest, much more important than in years past. And we just want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success in this very strange environment. Now, for class of 2022, I saw something pop up here. I think this also applies to 2022 to a lesser degree. Like I said, probably 90% of schools across the country went test optional for the class of 2021. Very, very, very few, maybe 5, maybe 10% said that they were going test optional for the class of 2022 and beyond. Okay. So I still think this is going to be valuable, especially since travel is limited. There are some other pieces, but I don't think it'll be up to a third. Again, that's my best guess, like it is for 2021, but it may be 10%, it may be 15%, which is still a pretty significant percentage as we're looking at the big picture. Okay. Hopefully that helps. All right, moving along. And again, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we'll cover them at the very end as well. So number 2 is the test optional policies themselves. And I've already kind of touched on this a little bit. So many schools have moved in this direction, but I think we need to better understand what this means for our students. When a school says that they're test optional, it can mean 100 different things. And that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but probably not by much. College admissions, they're notorious for thinking that they're smarter than every other school. So they create their own policies that may look completely different than the school next door that everybody thinks that they're the same, right? Like a KU and K-State policy may look completely different. And trust me, they do. All right. So some things to keep in mind here is test optional. First of all, you're going to have to look at each individual institution, which is kind of a lot to deal with already. But this should go into what we had talked about in our first webinar, where students are kind of starting to track that information. They're already gathering that information, creating their quote unquote resume in their Google Doc or whatever kind of format you all choose to use. So knowing what these schools' requirements are and what their deadlines look like, and of course policies like test optional are important. So again, this is not test blind. Very, very few schools are test blind these days. There are a few across the country. Most of them are liberal arts schools in the Northeast, where literally you can submit an ACT or SAT, but they literally will not look at it. If colleges, this is a little insider baseball, if a college doesn't ask for the information or there's no place to put it on their application, and again, I know Common App has made this a little muddier, but if you can hop on, every college still has their own, almost all colleges have their own application. So you can hop on there and at least flip through and see what they require. Because if they don't have a spot for ACT scores or SAT subject scores or whatever it may be, it's not like somebody is sitting there entering this data into a computer like we used to, right? This is automatically going into the system. And if they don't have a field for it, they don't have a place for it in their CRM, their client resource management tool. So they're not even using it. They can't use it to make a decision. So things like that are going to be important to kind of pay attention to. It's sometimes the little things that help us kind of see what a school finds important in the process. So very few are test blind where they literally won't use it, but watch for it. The other thing is differences in acceptance rates. Right? Oftentimes students who apply test optional have lower acceptance rates, and some of it, and again, as well-intentioned as admissions offices are, there's some subjectivity that goes into this for sure. And if they see a student who has not submitted an ACT or SAT score, they're going to assume that they're scoring a little lower than this other student who submitted theirs, and their resumes look almost identical, right? So again, who's going to get accepted at that point? Probably the kiddo who actually had this great resume, but also submitted their scores, and they're kind of what they were looking for pre-COVID. All right. I would also, maybe the most important piece is with regard to scholarshiping. All right. Now, this has been an interesting thing that we've seen where sometimes families think they hear test optional and they think, oh, I don't have to submit my scores at all. Well, I think some schools are reworking their matrices right now for scholarshiping, for their merit-based aid. But from my conversations with universities, they are still going to be requiring ACT scores in order to award scholarships. So sometimes maybe we don't think a whole lot about $1,000 or $2,000 or maybe even up to a $4,000 scholarship per year. But again, $16,000, I don't know a student who could work part-time effectively during school and other things aren't suffering and can make that $4,000 during the academic year. That's just a challenge for a lot of students. So again, it's just taking that money right off the top line. And I don't know why we wouldn't really be open to free money as much as we possibly can. So again, there's still some value for it, even if it's not in the admission side. Okay. So some little things to kind of pay attention to. All right. And I kind of touched on this already. Class of 2021, it's going to look different than 22 and beyond. All right. The one other thing that I'll throw out, when test optional became a thing way back, maybe 15, 20 years ago, and I was working and living in Boston at the time. And in the Northeast, there were two things that were going to happen. One, every school was going to be test optional in the next 3 years. And the college bubble, the cost of college, that bubble was going to pop within the next 3 years, right? So this was back in 03, 04, 05. Everybody was talking about it. Clearly, neither has actually come true. Now, COVID has kind of put a wrench in it, but I still think most schools find value in testing and they want to see that piece. All right. But when this all first started, this test optional idea, a school like NYU or Brandeis actually fits the model of what they were actually intending for test optional. So NYU, you can submit ACT scores, you can submit SAT scores, you can submit 3 AP exams, you can submit IB exams, you can take 3 SAT subject tests. It's all these different options, right? Test optional. And that's how they're going to make their decision. They're using that information. The student gets the choice. You can take whatever tests you want. Here are the sets that you can choose from. Maybe there are 6, maybe there are 8. And then you can kind of go from there. And I think that is probably a better long-term strategy with testing if schools are going to go test optional. Now, again, those other exams are not measuring what the ACT and SAT are measuring per se, so it may not be as useful data, which is why I think most schools have not gone that way. But again, if we're going to go test optional and eliminate, again, in the current sense, and just eliminate the need for these pieces, I think we lose some vital data along the way. And again, if it didn't have any value, I don't think the organizational data people on campus wouldn't be screaming, "Hey, look at this! This is one of the most important pieces of the admission cycle." All right. Any questions on that one? All right. Moving into number 3, the writing and essay component of the ACT and SAT. So these have shifted a lot over the last, well, probably even the last 5 years, but especially over the last 10 or 15. They introduced them basically in 2005, and then again in the early 2010s for the ACT. And basically these were tools that ACT and SAT developed to help colleges know how students, how effective they are as writers, right? Now, what's come out and what's actually happening here is very different than what colleges kind of expected to begin with. So students are given a basic score. So on the ACT, that score is between 2 and 12. There are 2 graders scoring at 1 to 6 each, and then you just add those 2 scores together, okay? Some of the challenge here is that the percentiles, how it's actually scored, are kind of skewed. 5 years ago, a 7 was about average. Now a 5 or a 6 is about a 50th percentile. So I think, I'm not sure most colleges are fully aware of that, to be completely honest. And so I don't think the evaluation piece is as good. And they're seeing lower scores, and I just think that they don't deem them as valuable because most colleges have moved away from these. There are maybe a handful of schools across the country, generally more selective, highly selective schools that are requiring the writing section or the essay of the SAT. So just kind of know, again, unless they actually explicitly ask for it, they're not going to require it. Now, going back to Get Smarter Prep's general recommendation on this, if a student walks in and they have zero clue what kind of college they want to apply to or where they want to go, then we go ahead and recommend that they go ahead and take the writing section, because it's not necessarily going to hurt them. It's just an extra 40-minute section at the end of a test, and maybe they'll do their best, maybe they won't after sitting there for 4 hours already. But we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to apply to any school that they so choose. Okay. If you don't have the writing section and you fall in love with a school that requires the writing section, there are only 2 options. One, you got to check it off your list. You can't even apply because you don't meet the requirements. Or 2, we have to retake the ACT again, and that's not fun either. All right. Any questions here in the writing and essay components? All right. So this is a pretty hot topic, an important piece to cover right now is super scoring. Historically, we've seen about maybe 60% of schools across the country super score the ACT for the SAT. Super score the SAT, and about a third, maybe about 33% super scoring the ACT. All right. So we want to make sure that we are helping our students kind of understand the trend here, and that trend is absolutely towards super scoring. It's even in the regard in regards to scholarshiping. There are a lot of things that are happening that make zero sense from our side, but we want to make sure that students are set up for success in this way. So what is super scoring? Super scoring, for those of you that don't know, is a student takes a test twice. They combine the best subject scores into one super score. All right, so maybe on one test you had a 27 in English and a 30 in math, and the next one you flip it. You have a 30 in English and a 27 in math. They're going to take the 2 30s and count those toward the super score. All right. The ACT actually for decades actively told colleges, do not super score for the ACT. So a big shift happened last spring. It may have been closer to the winter, and ACT actually released some data that they'd been collecting since 2013 and 2015, and these different surveys and different pieces of information they've been looking at, and they actually decided that actually super scores are a better indicator from the data that we have. So I think that we're going to see more and more schools super score. I would, again, these are our estimates and it's changing every day, but I would estimate about 60% of schools will be super scoring for the ACT in some capacity this year. And I think that's only going to grow over the next 3 to 4 years. Okay. So that's an important piece to watch for. So generally speaking, we've recommended to most students, let's take the test one time, get our absolute best score and be done with it. Now, again, that only happens for a subset of students. So they end up taking it a second time or maybe a third. But I think we're going to be transitioning into a more regular two-test approach, or again, we'll touch on this here in just a moment, is the computer-based and section retesting. I think we may use those different pieces as we move forward. Okay, I saw a question pop up. Let me see. Give me one quick moment. Let me pull up some data here in a moment. And the question had to do with what are the selective schools actually doing? What are highly selective schools looking for when it comes to super scoring? And I have some good data here. I'm going to see if I can. Hopefully it doesn't take too long here. I apologize for this. It's actually something that I usually have sitting right in front of myself all day long, but I closed all my tabs. Well, I'll send some of the actual data to you all here after a while. But we have some amazing data that kind of has tracked probably about 80 to 100 of the most popular schools that our students choose to go to or are highly interested in. And I would say kind of has tracked probably about % of those schools are super scoring, if not more. And again, just like any other school, even some of our regional schools, two schools that look almost identical, they're going to have different policies. So you're going to see some schools, whether it's in the Ivy Leagues or the Ivy-like schools, that will super score, and you'll see some that will not. I was hoping to pull that data up really quickly, but it didn't work out for me. Okay. And again, Elena, I will share that information with you at some point. Did I see another question come through? I didn't get a chance to see it. Oh, Jill, did you see something else there?
Nope, that's it. There's one from Amy.
Okay.
Super score in the writing section. Do you foresee an option of taking the writing section on its own, or will it continue to be an add-on to the complete ACT test?
Okay. So the question has to do with the writing section. I don't know if y'all could hear Jill there. And whether the writing section will ever be a retest section. Again, a lot has been up in the air with the retesting, and we'll spend a minute on that retesting here in a moment. I'm not sure what they're going to do with this, to be completely honest. I don't think they've disclosed this information yet. The retesting has been focused on the multiple choice sections, just because so few students take the writing section, and it's a little bit more difficult or changes the dynamics a bit when a student is typing, which is how all section retesting is going to happen compared to writing it out. So I think there may be some variance there, and I think that's maybe why they haven't announced anything yet. I'm not going to say that they won't do it, but I would be hesitant to believe that they will move in that direction, just partially because so few schools require it, and because of that maybe extra bonus advantage to actually doing it on a computer. Okay. The last thing I want to touch on with super scoring is not only do different institutions have different policies, and you kind of have to dig into your school set to kind of determine what those look like, but even within the school, within the university, they may be evaluating these differently across campus. So an admissions office, for instance, maybe they don't super score, and maybe that's the information that we've seen, but guess what? Maybe their financial aid office does super score for scholarships. We're seeing this more and more. University of Arkansas has done this for a number of years now, where their admissions office does not super score, but they reciprocate in-state tuition for out-of-state students from Kansas and Missouri. who score certain ACT scores and have particularly good GPAs. Okay, so it's a huge advantage. Again, some students improving a point could mean $8,000 or $9,000 a year, which is a huge chunk. Okay, KU has actually moved in this direction this year, where their admissions they're not going to super score, but for financial aid they will take that into account. So some little things to watch for as you're kind of moving through the process. I wish everything were clean and colleges just, here is the stuff that you as a family and you as a student want, because we know it. And these are the most important things. Unfortunately, sometimes we have to dig, or again, don't be afraid to pick up the phone. I know I am hesitant to pick up a phone for some reason. Maybe it's just my age, or I don't know what it is. But I'd much rather shoot an email or something like that. But sometimes, or just search on my own forever. But I've had a lot of success reaching college admissions offices, even this summer when things are chaotic, and just allows us to kind of get that question answered from a human. And again, they can also put some little caveats. So when I talked to some schools recently, like Mizzou, they informed me that this was last week, maybe the Friday, so maybe a week and a half ago. And Mizzou shared with me that everything on their website is probably going to be out of date very soon for the class of 2021, because they're reworking their matrix for scholarships, and they didn't know what that was going to look like yet. It hadn't been finalized. So kind of watch for those little pieces along the way too, okay? All right, moving right along. So into section retesting and computer-based testing. So this is one of those kind of humorous, funny parts from our side, working in the industry. 2013, ACT came out and released that by 2015, every student will be taking the ACT on a computer. And clearly that hasn't happened. As of 2018, 2019, there were about 5% of students nationwide that were taking the ACT on the computer. Everything else was pencil and paper. All right. So that is going to be shifting fairly rapidly in some cases. So those of you who have a student in Blue Valley decided a couple weeks before the Kansas test. So the state of Kansas started administering an official ACT at school in February, the last 2 years. And students during that kind of got sprung on them a little bit late, but they were everybody took it online. Everybody took it as on a computer. And again, I think there are some challenges in that. Inherently, some students are just much better. They're just more tech savvy than others. Sometimes technology doesn't work the way that it's supposed to, which is clearly going to be a hindrance. And then again, just different sections. I think there are advantages to some, at least how I perceive it. Things like the reading section, or maybe the English section, where we can kind of move through some things a little bit more quickly, whereas maybe the math section, sometimes for most students, kind of actually getting in and writing and drawing and doing those things, those are the things that are important. So sometimes students will have to spend the time to redraw a figure so that they can kind of manipulate it along the way. And I think that takes extra time, and time is of the essence on the ACT. So I think for some students it's great, others it's bad. Some sections it's good, some sections it's bad. So we'll see how that continues to have an impact in the long run. But we've actually introduced language for computer-based testing into our newest manual that we developed this summer, to make sure that we can support those students along the way as effectively as possible. The other piece to this, and maybe the most important, because it's going to be ubiquitous and it's going to be valuable for students everywhere, is section retesting. And this is in this category because all section retesting will all be computer-based. All right. So this isn't where a student, they've taken a full-length test on paper, pencil and paper, and they can go choose to just do the math section on paper. It's going to have to be computer-based. All right. So I want to make sure that we're kind of looking at that from a realistic perspective, because certain sections we're probably going to be better suited for that format altogether. The other thing that I really want to stress here is we still don't fully know when ACT is going to roll out this section retesting. It was supposed to come out this fall. So I guess it is September already, isn't it? So in a week and a half, they were supposed to have this section retesting for students. But with COVID, so many students didn't get to take the test, especially class of 2021 in April or June or July, that they scrapped it. They pushed it into what they call 2021, and they opened up more seats for students to take a test for the first time, or again, maybe they needed to take the whole test again. So retesting in that format. I am optimistic that when they say we're going to push it to 2021, I'm optimistic that it's going to be for the spring of 2021, but I'm not positive that's actually going to happen. I tend to be more optimistic than I probably should. I think that it'll probably realistically be more for the fall of 2021. So students who are in the class of 2021 probably will not benefit from this whatsoever. But I do think that the class of 2022 may have an opportunity. But again, I don't want students to bank on this, right? We had students who came through last July and last September who took the test. They saw a really good improvement, but there was a section that they wanted to retest. They saw this information come out from ACT. And so they just expected it. They planned on it. And I think that really threw off certain students and their approaches and how they would have gone about preparing in the best way possible. Because again, waiting a full year to go back and review, if it's for a section, okay, we don't have to redo a bunch of work to get back to where we were and then build on that. But if we're doing that for all 4 sections now, that can be a lot of heavy lifting and a lot more expense and energy and time than what was initially thought. Okay. Any questions here in computer-based? All right. So here we're going to talk a little bit about enrollment trends, and I've touched on some of them, but there's some interesting things to keep in mind. We work with families from all over the metro, and they come from lots of different backgrounds. So as a parent, I would encourage you to keep some of these in mind moving forward with your student. Some of it, again, this isn't even on here, and I wasn't planning on talking about it, but again, just kind of knowing even what do these scores mean? And if you come in for a scores back, we have that conversation with every student and every family where we're going to help you better understand what the test is about, but even like how it's scored, like what does my score mean? Sometimes we have a misconception, especially in our area here in Johnson County or Kansas City, Missouri, or wherever it may be, where we aren't fully aware of what the scores mean, because we see something like a 20 and we think, okay, that's not what I was shooting for, right? I hear that a lot. But again, if we put it into context, and that's actually the 52nd percentile, which means more than 50% of current college students are already envious of that 20 that a student achieves. Okay. Or a 30. Again, I'm just going to jump way up there and go by tens here. So a 30, a lot of families think, oh, everybody scores a 30 or higher. It's actually the 93rd percentile. So only 7% of college students scored a 30 or above. So little things like that can kind of help us kind of gauge what's important. What are these schools? How competitive are these schools in reality? Okay. Because as soon as we start talking about selective and highly selective schools, if their average scores are 31 to 34, now we're talking about their average student is in the top 3 to 5% of all testers, right? So we're talking about a very, very competitive place. And we just want to make sure we're finding fits for our students along the way. Fun fact. So in 1994, there were 8.7 million students in college. Okay. The number of colleges has not changed really. There may be a couple that have popped up, but there have also been quite a few that have closed. And we in 2020, they projected, and again, this may be a little bit off, but just due to COVID, but we are at about 14 million students in college in 4-year institutions. This is not taking into account vocational schools or 2-year schools or anything like that. So we've had a 61% increase in numbers of students in the last 26 years, but we don't have more schools. So our highly selective schools, they've always worked at capacity. So now we're just talking about more students, more competition. Those of us who went to an amazing school, it looked that student population looks different now. It's even more competitive, believe it or not, than it was in 1994, based on this data. Okay, so little things like that, kind of watching those trends. Enrollment is way up, and we want to make sure that we're taking that into account as well. The other thing that I'll throw out there is because of COVID, fewer students are going to be going far away for college. Like so many students are wanting to stay close to home. Well, this could give students who are still motivated and willing to try something new and go far away, it may give them a little bit more competitive advantage compared to previous years. So I'm encouraging students to apply to more reach schools this year than ever before. Because if enrollment or if applications are down even 10 or 15% at some of these selective schools, I think it gives that student who may have been on the cusp before a much better chance here for this class. So again, so much has changed, so much is up in the air, but I think there are some things that we can kind of follow that'll help our students out. For class of 2022, I think it's a little bit too early to be able to tell exactly what some of those trends are going to look like. And enrollment may be back to normal. It's just tough to say at this exact moment. But for 2021, I think that there are some important pieces to kind of watch for in that regard. Some little things in here. It talks about the application process and early action, early decision. We talked about those terms in our last webinar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. But acceptance rates are usually a touch higher there for students who apply early action or early decision compared to regular decision. So that's something to kind of watch for and pay attention to. But on the flip side of that is scholarships are generally quite a bit less for students who apply early action or early decision than for students with regular admission. So you have to kind of weigh those priorities and what's important and maybe what's in the savings plan and things like that. So kind of watch for that. The other piece of this is I think we're going to have a pretty significant transition. And if there's ever been a time for the cost bubble to burst in higher education, many schools are $60,000 or $70,000 a year now. I think it's going to be in the nearest future. And again, I know people have been saying this for well over a decade. But again, so many schools are going to an online format for, if not all of their classes this fall, for many of them. And I think that the perceived value is going to be different in these situations. And I want to make sure that we're kind of looking at that information. And again, it may or may not impact our students in the next year or two, but it may impact our decisions. How do we decide what that best path is? Maybe if we're looking at a highly selective school and all of their classes are going to be online, maybe the learning environment's going to be better for a year or maybe for all 4 years at a local school where we can kind of engage with our professors and other students in the classroom. Okay.
Mary asked, have you heard about any trends and decreases in applications from international students, which may open up more spots for U.S. students in highly selective schools?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So Mary asked the question about international applications and how that's going to affect enrollment on college campuses and opening up spots for domestic students. And I absolutely think that's going to be the case. Again, there's so many students internationally who are traveling or who are not traveling, who are again, just kind of in this limbo period. And I do think that's going to impact enrollment. Now, I think that there are still a lot of students internationally that will still come, but I do think the number is going to be lower than in years past. I think across the board, except for maybe local students, which may actually be up for universities. I think anybody traveling from 50 miles or more, including international, I just think that enrollment is going to be considerably down for schools. Okay, good question. I like it. All right. So these factors in the admission decision, and I tried to put these in the order, and I alluded to some of this earlier, so I stole some of the thunder, so I probably won't spend a ton of time here. But again, first and foremost, the most important thing is a student's GPA. Colleges are going to want to know their grades and class rank, take that information into account. And then, of course, strength of schedule is probably the second most important. And that's going to be demonstrated by taking AP or IB classes or even just honors classes. Some schools don't allow students to take AP classes until they're upperclassmen or whatever that may look like. So making sure that the student is challenging themselves. Now, I would argue that I think most schools are savvy enough to recognize that a student, even a very good student, they don't excel in every single subject. Like they may not love math, but they absolutely love the English arts and history. And again, challenging yourself in those areas that are appropriate, maybe, right? Sometimes math is very sequential. I get it. So maybe that next step is Calc AB or Calc BC. And that could be absolutely fine if the student is engaged and they're gonna perform well, and it's not going to be too overwhelming. Again, there may be other options like an AP Stats class, which may be not as weighted as heavily in the strength of schedule equation, but I do think that one, they're going to get something like maybe that college credit, but learn some new skills that I think are going to be applicable in the long run, and maybe not kill themselves with their school load. Okay, so I think that's going to be an important piece to watch for. The third is, of course, standardized tests. And again, for class of 2021, I think this looks different, but I still think for those schools who are accepting scores and that aren't completely test blind, I think that these are still going to be maybe the most important or up there, just because what else are they going to be gauging this information based upon? Like I said, the trend line toward the end of junior year and beginning of senior year is typically so important and so strong as they're evaluating these transcripts. And in this case, I'm just not sure how colleges are going to look at that. I don't know how, I mean, let alone like the logistics, but just what value can they garner from it? All right. And then we have things like the college essays, which I think are going to be more heavily weighted than usual. I think on top of demonstrated interest, I think that the essays are maybe the two most important for class of 2021 in particular, because it allows colleges to know who we are as a person, what we value, and make sure that we are a good fit. Because even if maybe academically we may not be the right fit in a normal year, maybe we are the perfect fit for them in lots of other ways. And this is an opportunity for us to convey that idea. And then some schools have their interviews. Anytime a college offers an interview, I strongly recommend jumping on it. I think that the time with an admissions rep, even if it is an alumni rep, I think those are times where you can, again, goes to that starred piece, show that demonstrated interest. Okay, if it's optional, strongly encourage your student to do it. Okay, and generally they're not hard, like very, very difficult interviews. They're typically fairly casual, trying just to get to understand and know the student a little bit more. In other cases, they are very intense. Don't get me wrong, but in most cases, I think that they're more conversational than anything else. Extracurricular activities, recommendations, I think those are still going to be on there. Knowing the school that you're applying to, community service may be something that has zero bearing. It may be something that could be highly important to the institution. We have some great schools across the country where, again, if you look at some of the data and numbers, there are schools like Brandeis, there are schools like Vanderbilt, where if we're looking at those schools, one, we have to be performing very well in the classroom and very well on test day. But those schools are known for their community service of their current students. So guess what? They're going to value that on the admission side as well, making sure that the students are engaged in their community. They are giving back. If you see a school that they emphasize this in their marketing material, that this is what our students do, we do 1 million hours of community service each year, or whatever it is, I don't know, then again, making sure that we emphasize that in our essays, we emphasize that in our applications, in our communication, all those different pieces, okay? All right, and then the last one, I think this has shifted even over the last 2 or 3 years, especially with super scoring becoming more popular, but persistence with testing, not necessarily even like just massive improvements, but I think there are some schools that like to see a student take it 2 or 3 times to show that they are really engaged. They really want this. They want to get to that next point. So again, this is not going to be vital at most schools, but I think there are some that if they're looking for a 25, they've told you they really want to see you get a 25, and you go from a 22 to a 23 to a 24, so you're not quite at that 25 yet. I think maybe they see you working, you're seeing some progress, you're putting in the time and energy, and I think that some schools will evaluate that. I had a student who was looking at Auburn this last year, and that was something that the admissions reps actively talked about at their school. So I think there are some different pieces there. And of course, every college has their own little things. So kind of pay attention, like I said, to the marketing component, and that'll tell you what to emphasize and kind of how to go about it. All right. The 8th one is gap year. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time because I think most people know what gap year kind of means. It's definitely not for everyone, but it is becoming much more popular in the era of COVID. In my opinion, this is not the year to do it because I think that their travel opportunities are way lower. Even jobs right now, getting really good work experience during this time frame probably isn't as available compared to normal years. And we're kind of seeing the trend the other way, right? So the job market's going to be even more competitive for these students. So historically, 3% of high school grads take a gap year, okay? And then they go on to college. Now, oftentimes these are students who actually come back and they achieve at a very high level at the college level. But it's certainly, again, you step away from something. How engaged? I think you have to know your student to know what this looks like. But the other side of the coin here is 3%. You typically take a gap year. This year it could be up to 15 or 20%. That is a huge number, and some of that is just financial, right? A lot of families are just in a position where things are uncertain, and they're not sure if spending $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year makes a lot of sense for their particular student. I think community colleges are going to be busting at the seams. I may be wrong, but I think that we're going to see a trend back to that like we saw in during the housing bubble and things like that back in 07, 08, 09. So I'm going to keep my eye on that. And then again, this is inside baseball. This is my own perspective on this. Sometimes we think of families think about going to a community college to get some of the basics out of the way, to save money. I'm going to tell you, oftentimes, one, we don't save any money because oftentimes credits don't transfer to each school equally, right? So instead of spending 4 years at one school, maybe we end up spending 5 years in college. We lose opportunity for earnings in that 5th year. We spend extra tuition dollars, and oftentimes scholarships are not nearly as high for transfer students as they are for first-time freshmen. So little things to keep in mind like that even. Not saying that most of our families are not looking at going that route, but maybe you hear somebody talking about that and maybe you can share just a little bit of knowledge there. All right. So grades. This is an important one. And I'm going to spend more time on this one than number 10, and then we'll open it up to questions and kind of wrap things up. Okay. So with grades, we have seen there's been a lot of documentation with grade inflation that's happened. The University of California system, they did their long 18-month-year study into their students and what pieces of information were most valuable, which were most biased, things like that. And actually grades ended up being one of the more biased pieces in their world. And that oftentimes has to do with just how we're kind of evaluating them and the school and the pressure to get the best grades possible. Okay. So I think, and again, especially since most schools have gone away from class ranking, I think this makes evaluating grades even more challenging and other pieces become more important. This is one of those trends that I think either does exist or will exist in the near future as more and more schools dig into this data and information. A couple things here. Most of our students in high school, we have our weighted grades and our unweighted grades. Most colleges are going to recalculate your GPA in order to kind of level the playing field. Okay. So just know when you enter when your student enters their grades into their applications, they're just translating that straight over into the system, and they're recalculating the GPA based upon that information. All right. Some schools will just use every class. Some will only use core classes. Some will use core classes plus maybe some electives, but not all of them. These are things that, again, you can ask the admissions professionals about. But again, just knowing that our core classes are most important and the others are also important. They're just a little less important, maybe. Okay. I will say I reached out to a few schools recently, and Missouri State down in Springfield, Missouri, they are actually using weighted GPAs for scholarships, which is very interesting, especially since if you look at their website, their scale for their highest scholarships, you have to have a 28 or higher and a 3.7 to 4.0 GPA. So even their GPA scale only goes up to 4.0 on that piece, but they do use weighted GPAs for scholarships, which is amazing, right? I think the average GPA with weighted GPAs in Johnson County is probably a 3.7 or 3.8, right? With weighted GPAs. So making sure that we're kind of watching for those pieces and how different colleges are going to look at that data. I touched on this a moment ago, and it's the upward trend in grades is probably more important, maybe just important in a different way compared to continuously scoring, like doing well in school. Again, if a student has A's across the board in every class, all 4 years, perfect. That's the ideal. But again, a GPA doesn't tell the full story. Sometimes if a student really slacks during freshman year and then they actually get their act together and do very well in sophomore and junior year, again, colleges will recognize that trend. Some of the software that they have will actually, that they'll designate that as a trend, and they'll be able to see that information pretty readily. So I want to make sure that students don't kind of give up. They sometimes students think, oh, it's freshman year, I can't raise my GPA up to a 3.5 no matter what I do at this point. Well, again, maybe not, but there are some trends there that can help us demonstrate that we've turned things around, that we're taking things more seriously, and that college is an important next step. Okay. All right. Any questions on that one? All right. The 10th piece, again, is going to be fairly quick because it's SAT subject tests, and very, very, very few schools require them. In fact, out of the top 100 schools that our students say that they are interested in, there are only a handful that actually use them at all or actually require them. So Rice University down in Houston, an amazing school, especially for engineering and some other areas, Rice requires SAT subject tests still. Whereas like places like I mentioned them earlier, Brandeis and NYU, you can use them for their test optional in place of the ACT or SAT or whatever else. So I think that there is value at certain schools, but I think it's very, very, very limited. Most schools are talking in terms of we recommend these SAT subject tests. And again, if a student is absolutely amazing in math, but their ACT score is maybe, let's say it's a 31 and we're applying to an Ivy League school, well, maybe we want to take the the Math 2 SAT subject test to demonstrate that we have this amazing ability, score very, very well, and then kind of move forward from there. The other thing that I'll throw out there is is the scoring on the SAT subject test, because again, it's generally based upon the population that's actually taking the exam. And when we look at that, the percentiles on this are just absolutely bonkers. So if your student is a native speaker of another language other than English, okay, maybe you could take that language SAT subject test. But if you're just taking Spanish 4 as a senior or something, and you want to take the SAT subject test, I would strongly recommend against it. A perfect score, like a 790 to 800, is generally in certain languages like the 65th percentile, like a perfect score, just because so many of those students do absolutely perfect on the exam. And again, I think native speakers just generally have a little bit of an advantage in that regard. There are also certain things, again, the Math 1 subject test, we wouldn't recommend for anybody. Why it exists, I'm not fully sure. But it had a purpose 20 years ago, but that purpose is long gone at this point. So if you're going to take a math test, take the Math 2 SAT subject test. And then there are some other pieces with whether it's your European history or U.S. history or world history, not European, world history for SAT subject tests. We recommend that students go ahead and take these if they're going to take them during the May test date whenever possible. Okay. The early May test date just allows a student to have the entire year of curriculum under their belt before they actually take the exam. And it also kind of does some double duty. So if a student is taking U.S. history AP, and guess what? That test is going to be like a week after the SAT subject test for the U.S. history. So you're kind of doing double duty. You're studying for both. They're going to be very similar, at least the multiple choice pieces are. So that allows students to kind of just leverage that time and get their best scores. Okay. All right. I'm going to flip through these very, very quickly. So again, I think a lot of you already know our course offerings, small group classes, students, no more than 8 students in anything. Even our 2 class options are typically 3 to 5 students. And then semi-private is generally 2 students, but it could be as many as 4 if the students find good partners. Okay. Most popular here at Get Smarter Prep is private tutoring, and that just allows us to target the very specific areas that the student needs, customize that schedule along the way. All right. And then again, I've talked about the levels along the way. The website is a great resource. Hop on to getsmarterprep.com. There are some blogs on there. There are some really great podcasts, actually. Jill and I have put together almost three complete seasons now of our podcast, Simply Smarter. So you can find those anywhere you find normal podcasts. Your Apple, iTunes, there it is, Spotify, wherever you're going. Okay. So check those out. They can be kind of interesting. You just have to listen to me talk a little bit, but Jill's way more interesting and way more fun than I. All right. Any final questions as we begin to wrap up?
Wendy has one question.
Okay.
Are colleges blind to race ethnicity, meaning you do not have to report?
All right. So the question has to do with race in the application process. This is an interesting one. So most states, most places, you can't take race into account in the admission decision legally. But we're seeing some lawsuits come through, especially at some Ivy League schools, where there are students who have filed lawsuits because they feel like they were discriminated against based on race. And it's a lot of Asian American students, especially at Harvard or other schools on the East Coast, where their acceptance rates are much lower than what they should be strictly based upon the data. So I think that it's a component to be aware of. But I think most colleges are following the law and not evaluating that piece. So I'm I'd actually be surprised. I haven't looked at the Common App in this regard for a while, but I'd be surprised if that question's even popping up on most applications these days. It may be on a supplement piece for scholarships or things like that, because there may be a scholarship that has to do based upon race, but I'm not sure on the admission side specifically if there's anything that would be covering that. Really, I just want to thank you for taking some time this morning. Hopefully you've learned a little something. Hopefully me talking for this long hasn't put you to sleep, but we really do value you, and we look forward to continuing to serve the Kansas City metro area. All right. On there, you see the Simply Smarter podcast, but also shoot me an email if you have some questions, some follow-ups. My email is just caleb@getsmarterprep.com. All right. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Enjoy yourselves, and everyone stay well. Thanks.
High school can be tough. We'll help you navigate some of the areas you need help with, including the college preparation process, by providing advice for families. Every student is different and has a unique path. That's why we created this podcast. Our innovative and intentional approach builds confidence in the individual student. Listen each week to find out how students can score better on college placement tests with techniques and methods that build confidence, beat test anxiety, and identify strengths within each student. You're listening to Simply Smarter with hosts Caleb and Jill. Check out our blog at getsmarterprep.com for more college prep related topics.